Hey woodworkers, welcome back. Alright, so once again at the bandsaw, and we're talking about how to cut dovetails. Now, I know that many of you are turning off right now because you think that, or changing the channel, or watching somebody, a real woodworker, because you're thinking, no, that's not the right way to do it, that can't work. I'm going to show you this example as opening a conversation. I think that there is some real benefit of cutting dovetails by hand and doing the tails with a handsaw, pins with a handsaw, and that's great. This is just one other method for doing this. There's some benefits of understanding this process here if you have a ton of dovetails to do and you don't want to compromise quality, and you make your choices from this. But there are ways to incorporate this technique, as well as getting into hand cutting the pins as well. And so not fully stepping away from this as a philosophical problem, but I want to talk about it nevertheless. Okay, so I've laid out tailboard. I always start with tails, and so I need to do this before I can do anything else. The one thing, I did two things on this which are slightly unique. I've only laid out the marks here with the exception of the shoulder line. Shoulder line is done with my marking gauge, as I always do. The rest of the lines were drawn with a pencil, not cut in with a marking knife. And you'll see why here in a second. But I've done all the tail layout here via pencil, and I've also done it on both faces, which is something I would never do if I were going to do these by hand. If I'm doing these by hand, I do a knife line. Obviously the shoulder is cut, and then I also mark the ends of the boards. Can you see the ends? Yeah. And then handsaw here, do my thing. With this technique, it's really not necessary, and I think it's overkill to set up to cut these things with a bandsaw and then put in a knife line here. And again, you'll see here in a second. Alright, so there are some options. I can probably do okay by cutting this freehand and sliding this thing back and forth, but I would argue that you lose the benefit of what this process would afford if you're going to do this by hand or freehand. If you're going to do them freehand on the bandsaw, it's good, it's not great. And then there's always a variable here about how accurate you are when you are cutting, and I want these things to be right on the money. So with everything that I'm going to do as far as joinery, I've made sure that my saw is set up so I'm at a good position as far as squareness of the blade to the bed. I've also extended the guards here just so you can see what I'm doing. If it's just me here cutting, I would have these guards much lower to where they should be. But I want to make sure you can see what I'm doing. Okay, so the next step is that I'm going to use the fence in some capacity, but you'll see quickly that the geometry just doesn't add up on making these cuts with just the fence cutting into the blade, which these should be more or less parallel. So I need to hold this board at such an angle that will allow me to be able to make my cuts. And actually, this is the cut I'm probably going to be making. So with that being said, enter in this little jig. So I've laid out the angle of my dovetails. So my dovetails I like to be 1:7 or 7:1 ratio, and so that's what this jig is at. Whatever your dovetail ratio, you'll need to make one of these jigs, and make sure that we have good straight edges on both. The other thing you'll need is to have some type of a stop here. It does not have to be pretty babinga or no paduk. It could be whatever wood you need. I just had something that was roughly the same thickness, and it worked. So a stop here. What this will allow me to do is put this edge against the fence, and a little drive back and forth. Then I can bring my workpiece into place so it lines up with the blade. And by sighting this thing down, that looks about where I want to be. All right, so let me cut this one here, and then hopefully that'll make a little bit of sense. Okay, so the benefit here is I've cut one side of this tail, and I could continue to move the fence and work my way over here and then work my way around, but if I've laid these out symmetrically without changing the fence or anything, I can flip this around and cut this coming in from the other side. It looks like I'm a little bit off as far as my layout goes, but I'm still symmetrical. I can still go back and clean off that cut if I want. So I'm shutting off the saw, pardon me, don't ever do this. I'm shutting off the saw to explain to you the benefit of this jig, but also the possibilities. So what I want to do is I want to cut the pin that is closest to me right now, but I've got an option as far as how I do that. And what I'm setting up for here, I can go in and make my cuts, and that's going to be easy. I'll flip this thing around, be able to make the same cut. But I'm going to cut my stop off to almost nothing. It'll still work because, in essence, the only parts that really touch are just that crisp little corner, this point on this board here. So any extra length on the stop is somewhat irrelevant because I'm really only wanting to engage right in that very point. But by turning this thing around, I can set this up and I can reposition my fence. Oops. And I can make the cut that I need to going this way. The thing that I don't like about this orientation, I think you could probably see, oh yeah, that's not right. I'm good. No, that's right. Is that there's a lot of length off of the bed of this machine, and I just feel like this is really unsafe. Well, it's not wildly unsafe, it's just not the safest thing I've ever done. I really don't want this board to tip up as I'm cutting it because all the force from the bandsaw is going to force us back down at a high rate of speed. The other thing is, by having this hook on the far end close to me, as I'm cutting this, I could probably hold all these things in place, but I still need to get into a position where I could remove this, and so and remove it safely when I'm done with the cut. And any movement that I have as this thing is making its cuts is kind of something I want to avoid at all costs. Okay, so I am going to sacrifice a little bit of the length of this stop, and I think that was pretty good. All right, let me go from here. So I've got all my cuts made. Now I want to clean off some of the waste. So I've got most of it off. I haven't cut anywhere near the shoulders, which is good. I want to use my chisel to clean those things up. Bandsaw is good, but not great for making really clean cuts. And I just don't want to afford, or can't afford, to have any tearing out there. What you see in the center of this is still a lot of waste that needs to go away. Oops. A lot of waste that needs to go away. Focus. Lovely. So I can go back in there with chisel, I can go in there with a coping saw, both of which sound horrible to me. It's a tight clearance to get in here, and so I want to avoid coming in there with another tool, and I've got arguably one of the best tools at my disposal right here for this process. Even if I were to make both of these cuts by hand with a handsaw, I would still want to come in and clear out most of that waste, and so the bandsaw is perfect. So we'll turn this back on, clear off that center material. So hopefully you can see the ease of this. Certainly the speed and the accuracy goes a long way. If I had a really wide board with a bunch of tails to deal with, I would definitely consider this as an easiest and the smartest option. If I wanted to break away from the symmetry of these elements and start kind of reflecting that this is a bit more custom or handmade, it's easy enough for me to start modifying where these lines are, and I could start to adjust, making this one maybe a little narrower, this one's a little bit wider. That could be reflective of handwork. It's all about trying to sell this thing. And so if this one looks too right off the machine, or we think that people will fear or view this as being done with a router jig, then I would encourage you to start exploring what type of custom cuts you can make on this to, again, just modify dimensions. What else was I going to say? Okay, so again, a wider board, this is a no-brainer, chop, chop, chop. I would avoid this, making this jig any more complicated than it needs to be. I think it's very easy to put another piece on the bottom that will hold or cradle this board into place. You'll notice once that corner is gone, I can no longer use this at the same at the same location of the fence. I could still use this up against the shoulder. If I did want to come in with another series of cuts for the tail, they would just have to be modified for the fence. Okay, so I was talking about having a bottom under this. So if I were to put a bottom here, my workpiece would set into this. That's all fine and well. What the problem with that is going to suggest is that I can no longer flip this piece around if I've got this little sled situation in place. So I like having this one a little bit more awkward in this way, because just a thin piece, that's all I need to be able to come in and do my cuts, and I can do it in either orientation. All right. So some people really push this process, and they start to explore what they can do with cutting joinery on the bandsaw. The thing that I would avoid, but a lot of people do, is once all the tails are cut and the shoulders are clean, then we translate this board to what the pin board is going to be. We can bring that to the bandsaw, and then you do one of two things. You could start to pivot the bed, and whatever the angle is that needs to be matched to the tails, and then set up a stop so that you're only plunging from the tip of the blade to wherever your shoulder is. The stop here will function as just that, so you can't advance past that point, and that's okay. The other thing that people do, instead of tilting the bed of the bandsaw, is they will create an auxiliary bed here at the correct angle, and it just seems nuts. I would never do that. It's too much time, and I'm so much faster in cutting the pins by hand. I think this is a lot of extra work, and so people have used table saws. So they have a sled here, they tilt the blade, they run this thing over the table saw, and then they do something very similar to what we just did. By cutting the pins on the table saw, they can create some type of wedge here that holds the board at the appropriate angle. I just think a lot of that is work for people that really hate doing hand-cut joinery, and I'm not that person. So this is just a process for getting me started, and then I can get into the fun stuff, the detail stuff with cutting pins when I need to. Okay, hopefully that was helpful. See you.